Hello everyone, Mr. Linder here. Let's talk about the ATP requirements in skeletal muscle cells. So skeletal muscle fibers use ATP constantly during the contraction and relaxation of the skeletal musculature. The myosin heads actually use ATP in the sliding filament mechanism. Calcium ATPases use ATP for relaxation in skeletal muscle cells in order to pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulums. And the sodium-potassium pumps use ATP to restore ion concentrations after the muscle action potentials have occurred. So ATP is necessary for many actions within a skeletal muscle fiber. However, the amount of ATP in a muscle fiber is only sufficient for about 8 muscle twitches. And 8 muscle twitches accounts for only about 5 seconds of activity. So if you're looking at stored ATP, right, if we're looking at stored ATP, we have a limited amount of ATP in order to run skeletal muscle cells and therefore control the skeletal muscle organs. We're looking at about 5 seconds of activity. So we need a backup of ATP from other mechanisms. The phosphocreatine pathway is a backup source of ATP in muscle cells. Phosphocreatine is actually produced at rest from creatine and ATP. So when you have muscle cells at rest, you can use ATP from metabolism to transfer a phosphate to creatine in order to produce phosphocreatine. And so phosphocreatine is a backup storage molecule to produce some ATP when our stored ATP levels have been depleted. So when muscle cells are working, so if we're looking at working musculature, the phosphate that is found on phosphocreatine can be transferred to ADP in order to produce ATP that's needed for skeletal muscle cell activity. In order to do this, you need an enzyme to run these reactions. So whether we're running the reaction to create phosphocreatine or whether we're breaking down phosphocreatine, there's an enzyme that's going to run this metabolic pathway. And this enzyme is creatine phosphokinase, or also called creatine kinase. And what this particular enzyme is doing is it's catalyzing the forward or reverse reactions when the muscle is either at rest or when the muscle is working, so that you can either create phosphocreatine or break phosphocreatine down. So what we see is the enzyme essentially adding a phosphate if we're going to create the phosphocreatine, and essentially we're taking the phosphate away so that it can be taken away from the phosphocreatine and be added back to ADP in order to produce ATP. Now, the amount of ATP that can be generated is only about 10 seconds worth. So if we're looking at the total of stored ATP and ATP that can be regenerated from the phosphocreatine pathway, we're only talking about supporting 15 seconds of muscle activity. So 15 seconds of muscle activity is going to be good for intense exercise like powerlifting and sprinting kinds of activities, but it's not going to be beneficial for long duration endurance activities. So there has to be a way to manufacture new ATP from other sources. So what muscle cells must do is they have to be able to create ATP from stored nutrients or freely available nutrients that have been absorbed from the digestive system that are currently circulating in the cardiovascular system. If you're going to maintain longer periods of activity, there has to be mechanisms to produce more than just the 15 seconds of ATP from stored levels of ATP and the phosphocreatine pathway. So where are we going to get more ATP, and what sort of processes are going to give us that ATP? Well, it really comes down to anaerobic and aerobic metabolism being able to provide more ATP for skeletal musculature. And the primary nutrients that we're going to get access to are going to be carbohydrates and fats. So carbohydrates are going to be in the form of stored glycogen, or it's going to be in the form of plasma glucose that you've absorbed directly from the digestive system. And then your other source of nutrients is primarily going to be fatty acids. And so we can have free plasma fatty acids, or we can break down triglycerides and get fatty acids from those stored triglycerides. So carbohydrates and fats are going to be our primary nutrients for ATP production. Glycogen is stored in liver cells. It's stored within muscle, and it'll be used for ATP production. And then, of course, a lot of our fatty acids are stored within adipose tissue as triglycerides, and then we'll access the free fatty acids when the triglycerides are metabolized. The most efficient way to produce ATP is going to be through aerobic metabolism. So aerobic metabolism is going to give us the most ATP in order to sustain muscle activity. So this is going to support exercise for hours at a time, as long as there is adequate amounts of oxygen. So for aerobic metabolism to work, there has to be enough oxygen to support the metabolism of glucose and fatty acids into ATP. However, if oxygen supply does not meet the oxygen requirements, then we're going to see a shift to anaerobic metabolism. So we're going to move to anaerobic metabolism when there's a decline in oxygen. And of course, that makes less ATP. And what's also of interest is that when you're shifting to anaerobic metabolism, there's a lot less usage of fatty acids. So if we look at this particular diagram, here we have our free plasma fatty acids in yellow. So this is fatty acids. And as the exercise intensity increases, we can see the level of fatty acid utilization declining. And our utilization for stored glycogen, and therefore getting access to glucose, is actually increasing. Because in order to run anaerobic metabolism, you need to be able to run glycolysis using glucose. So as intensity increases and as oxygen availability declines, then our ATP production from fatty acids is going to decline as we shift utilization to glucose levels. So essentially, when a cell eventually lacks oxygen and is shifting to anaerobic metabolism, you're going to see less fats being utilized, more sugars being utilized, but the ability to maintain that activity is going to go down dramatically. And so being able to sustain heavy exercise obviously is going to decline when you're shifting into anaerobic metabolism. During anaerobic metabolism, we will also see the production of lactic acid as the pyruvate from glycolysis is being converted into lactic acid in order to replenish the NAD molecules that are used in the glycolysis pathway. So lactic acid production is going to go up when you shift to anaerobic metabolism as well, and that's going to begin to create an acidosis that takes place. So there's a lot of things happening when we shift out of aerobic to anaerobic, that's not going to allow skeletal musculature to sustain contractions for longer periods of time. So a summary of what's going on during ATP utilization in skeletal musculature might look something like this. So muscle tissue relies on stored ATP and phosphocreatine for short duration muscle activity. So when we talk about stored ATP and we talk about the phosphocreatine pathway, although you can make ATP rapidly, so this diagram shows ATP produced in moles per minute. Although it's a rapid pathway for producing ATP, so we can see ATP production is high on this chart, the endurance, okay, designated by the yellow coloration, the endurance for stored ATP is not on this graph, but stored ATP and phosphocreatine, we got 5 seconds from stored ATP, and we've got 10 seconds from phosphocreatine. So we're only looking at an endurance of 15 seconds. So this is a very short-term solution to be able to do maximal intense events for a short amount of time. Glucose and fatty acids are used during aerobic metabolism to produce ATP. If you are talking about aerobic metabolism, although the production of ATP takes longer, because you actually have to go through glycolysis and the transition reaction and the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain for glucose, or you have to use beta oxidation for fatty acid metabolism. So although it takes longer to produce ATP, the amount of ATP that you could produce for minutes to hours at a time allows for the endurance levels of aerobic metabolism to be very high. So you can sustain aerobic metabolism for hours at a time. And that's because if you are using the glucose and the fatty acids that are available within the body, you can keep running metabolism to create the ATP necessary to sustain muscle contraction. Again, the glucose comes from the liver, it comes from stored glycogen within muscles, or it comes from immediate dietary intake. The aerobic metabolism, because it can use both glucose and fatty acids for ATP production, allows for moderate intensity exercise to be maintained for long periods of time. As the activity becomes more intense, then we need to shift to anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic metabolism does generate ATP faster than aerobic metabolism. It's about 2.5 times faster production of ATP, but it's such a small amount of ATP that is produced that it can only sustain maximal activity for about 1 minute of time. So only about a minute of maximal exercise is going to come from anaerobic metabolism. So when we are exercising, if you want to sustain exercising for long durations, you need to have good aerobic metabolism in order to do that, because stored ATP, phosphocreatine, and anaerobic metabolism are only going to be short duration activities and be able to maintain the intensity for a short amount of time, because the ATP is going to deplete too quickly. Another way to look at this is when you look at the intensity of the activity. So as the intensity of the activity increases, you'll notice right here at about the 70% level, if we stay below 70%, you actually can burn fats more efficiently than carbohydrates, So there's a fat burning that's taking place at a more efficient level than carbohydrates. But once you go above that 70% of intensity, the fat utilization within the body drops tremendously, and your carbohydrate utilization goes way up. And that's because you've shifted into this anaerobic metabolism, and anaerobic metabolism is going to rely predominantly on your blood sugar levels. So when you get into those maximum intense activities that are above, say, 70% of your maximum, carbohydrates are going to be your primary source of energy and not your fatty acids. So in low oxygen conditions, muscle tissue shifting to anaerobic and trying to sustain intense activity is just not going to be beneficial to the body, because you're at low ATP production and you're at low oxygen levels. So although it's faster in terms of ATP production, this anaerobic metabolism, it's not going to sustain muscle contraction like what you get with aerobic metabolism. I want to show you this other diagram because I think this is a nice diagram that's summarizing what I'm talking about. So muscle tissue needs ATP, right? We need a constant supply of ATP. We need that ATP when muscle's contracting. We need that ATP when muscle's relaxing. Some of that ATP is stored. Some of that ATP is replenished through the phosphocreatine pathway. But it's a very limited amount of time. It's that 15 seconds of time. So in order to sustain muscle activity, we need to rely on aerobic activities, or we need to shift into anaerobic if necessary. Now, we want to stay in aerobic as much as possible so that we can have oxidative phosphorylation and make large amounts of ATP. If we are in anaerobic, we're going to make small amounts of ATP. So if you want to have long endurance, you need to stay in oxidative phosphorylation and use the full glycolysis transition reaction to acetyl-CoA, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. That's going to give you your maximum ATP. In order to sustain that, we need a supply of glucose. So glucose comes from our intestine. This will be absorbed glucose. But we can also talk about fatty acids as well that are within the blood plasma. We're also going to get glucose, though, from our liver glycogen. And then there's also, of course, glucose available from stored muscle glycogen. So glucose is taken from the liver and it's dumped into circulation. And that glucose can be transported into muscle tissue. We're also getting, of course, fatty acids being transported into the muscle tissue directly from the blood plasma. We're getting more fatty acids from the breakdown of triglycerides. So the breakdown of lipids within our adipose tissue, so that we can get the fatty acids from adipose tissue, dump that into the blood plasma, and then, of course, we're transporting those in as well. So we're using fatty acids and glucose, right? So we're getting our glucose into the cells, we're getting our fatty acids into the cells, and we're using those in predominantly aerobic metabolism if you're going to sustain long-term muscle activity. When it goes anaerobic, we're going to focus predominantly on glucose. And so our carbohydrate utilization goes way up as our fatty acid utilization goes down. So that's a nice summary of what's taking place in skeletal musculature to be able to use ATP. A way to measure the activity within skeletal musculature and to look at essentially the intensity of exercise and to be able to quantify exercise is to look at something called the VO2 max. So because exercise can vary in intensity and duration, and it's difficult to quantify what that intensity and duration is doing to our skeletal musculature, we measure something called the VO2 max. The VO2 max is essentially an indicator of a person's ability to perform endurance exercises. And it's measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. The greater the VO2 max of an individual, the greater the ability of that individual to do exercise, to do physical work. The VO2 max can range anywhere from 10 in elderly and sedentary individuals to over 80 if we're talking about elite athletes. The VO2 max typically, though, in healthy females is about 29 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute of utilization. In healthy males, it's about 38. But if you train yourself, your VO2 max number will increase, and that will increase your ability to perform endurance exercises. To maximize your endurance training, it's actually important to know what's called your lactate threshold. Your lactate threshold is a percentage of your VO2 max. So it's the percent of your VO2 max at which there's a significant rise in blood lactic acid levels. Essentially, what we're saying is how much exercise can you do before you shift from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism and you begin to increase your blood lactic acid levels. The longer you can stay aerobic, the longer you can endure exercise. So elite athletes that have an 80 plus VO2 max can endure exercise much longer than the average person because it takes much longer for their lactic acid levels to build up in their body because they have such a high oxygen utilization per kilogram of body weight. So healthy individuals typically show significant lactic acid levels when they reach about 50 to 70% of their VO2 max. So for example, if your VO2 max is, say, 40, then you're going to see lactic acid accumulation when you reach a VO2 max around 20 to 30. But if you're an elite athlete with a VO2 max of, say, 80, you're not seeing significant lactic acid buildup until your VO2 max was 40 to 50, which means you can sustain activities much better as this elite athlete than you can as the average individual outperforming endurance activities. So the higher your VO2 max is, clearly the more endurance you're going to have. Creating a training program of high volume activities, so increased weekly minutes, maximum steady state activities where you actually perform activities at your lactate threshold, and also doing interval training where you go above and below your lactate threshold during your training activities will significantly increase somebody's cardiorespiratory endurance and will allow them to increase their overall endurance performance. The last thing to consider about musculature and ATP and utilization of oxygen is to look at what happens to oxygen consumption before, during, and after exercise. So during exercise, cellular energy use is actually going to exceed oxygen intake, and it's going to create an oxygen deficit. So as exercise begins, so this is the exercise begins level, you're going to have to utilize oxygen at a faster rate than you can actually consume, which is actually creating an oxygen deficit in order for you to reach a peak performance level and a peak oxygen consumption level during the duration of your activity. So if you create an oxygen deficit at the beginning of your exercise routine, once exercise stops, so if this is where exercise stops, you still have an excess post-exercise oxygen consumption that needs to take place. So when your exercise stops, you're going to have to continue consuming more oxygen than normal to basically make up for that oxygen debt that's been created. So to have enough oxygen to replenish stored ATP, to replenish phosphocreatine, to deal with lactic acid metabolism, to replenish oxygen with myoglobin, you're going to have to go into this EPOC, this excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, in order to make up for the oxygen debt that was created during skeletal muscle activity. So that was a bit on the utilization of ATP in skeletal musculature and a little bit on VO2 max and lactate thresholds and how that applies to endurance exercise. I hope that helps. Take care.